Welcome to today's webinar brought to you by NCSL. All lines have been placed in a listen-only mode to provide favorable sound quality during today's presentation. It is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Edward Seiler. Sir, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, Utah Methods to Test Payday Lending Regulation. My name is Edward Seiler and I am the Research Methodologist for the Louisiana Legislative Auditor's Office. I will be moderating our webinar today. I'd like to thank the National Legislative Program Evaluation Society and the National Conference of State Legislatures for sponsoring this webinar. NLPES is the NCSL Staff Association for legislative staff involved in program evaluation or performance auditing. One of its key purposes is promoting staff professional development opportunities like this webinar. Each year, the NLPES recognizes up to 3 offices for reports that demonstrate outstanding use of evaluation research methods. In 2017, the Utah Office of the Legislative Auditor General won the Excellence in Research Methods Award. During this webinar, Utah staff will explain their award-winning methodologies. And you can download PDF versions of the slides and the audit report by accessing the My Media Library feature as indicated by the page-shaped icon with a triangle in the middle of it. It's at the top of your page, and it should be visible right now. We will take your questions after the presentation has been given, but please feel free to enter your questions in the chat box at the lower left of your screen at any time. So, let's see. And our speakers today are Darren Underwood and James B. Hunnan. So it will take a day or so for the webinar to be archived, and once it's archived, you can access it at the link shown here. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Darren and James. Darren and James, off to you.
Okay, thank you, Ed.
Thanks, Ed.
We're happy to be here today. Happy Thursday, everybody. I had the opportunity to give this presentation at NLPES. I've scanned through some of the participants and know that some of you were there in Madison. And it was my pleasure to represent the office at that time. The only drawback last fall was that I did not have Jim with me, who was really the more boots on the ground staff member, the supervisor of this audit. So I'm happy to have him with me today to color commentate and give a lot more flavor. So one of the things I wanted to do before we dive into some of our findings is, it was several years ago at an NLPES seminar that some of us colleagues discussed an emerging trend in auditing, and that was more legislators, at least in some of our experience, were asking us to audit outside of the public domain in areas like payday loans, bail bond industry. We had in Utah low-level nuclear waste being brought in, and they wanted us to look at whether that was a safe process. All three of these being private sector ventures. And so one of the things that will kind of weave through the theme of this is some of the challenges we had in trying to audit what was essentially a private sector venture. So we bumped up against some litigation at times and a lot of roadblocks to get the data, but in the end we prevailed, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. The first thing that we want to do, because there are some states, there are 15 states where payday lending is not allowed. So we want to make sure that everybody understands what the definition of a payday loan is, more common or more technically called a deferred deposit loan. This exists when an individual needs a cash advance and uses their collateral as collateral their next paycheck. And so they can get some cash in hand. So in this next slide, maybe I can have Jim explain how this typically works based on this figure that is in our report.
So you may have your paycheck coming every 2 weeks. Typically the loans last for 2 weeks. If you were to say get a loan for $300, they would give you that money, and then in 3 weeks you would pay off that loan, or in the 2 weeks you'd pay off that loan. And if you paid $360 as a payoff, your APR would be $521.
But 521%.
21%, yes. Excuse me.
When we first got into this venture, we thought, wow, people actually pay this percentage rate. It is almost unbelievable.
Now, Darren, I noticed a error in our chart there. I didn't notice before. That should be a 60, not a 360. And a $60 payment over 2 weeks for a full year would be 521 APR. But of course, the loan is just for 2 weeks, and ideally, and the intent is usually to pay off that loan in the 2 weeks, and so after 2 weeks you'd come back and you'd pay off with your new paycheck. You pay $360.
That's right. So let's move to the next slide, because this in and of itself, while is a little surprising, it can be expensive, but it's not unmanageable. But what happens is when an individual gets into a situation where they continue to stay in payday loans, that's where it gets expensive, because they continue to extend the loan after the first 2 weeks to the next 2 weeks, and so on until 70 days, and they have essentially paid for the loan and the like amount of $300 to pay it off.
We show in this chart 70 days because 70 days is the limit that we have in Utah on the number of extensions you can have. You can go as far as 70 days. And we found quite a few people that actually do this. It's hard to imagine, but they'll borrow $300, in 2 weeks pay $60, 2 weeks pay $60, and so on until 70 days, and they'll come back and pay $360. So by 70 days, when 70 days is up, you have pretty much paid the same amount for interest as you have for principal, which for most of us is mind-boggling. But it really is interesting that there is this population, usually a poor population, that want to use this.
So what happens is, and we were able to find this great analogy in some of our academic research, that the problem with this kind of usage is that there's temptations for overuse. So a lot of us will take a cab to the airport, or I guess nowadays it's more like taking Uber. This is expensive, but it's necessary. This short-term transportation is needed to get here and there. Like I said, it's expensive, but it meets a need. But the problem comes if you were to use this more than just for short-term. In other words, you wouldn't get into a cab to go across country, or you may stay in a hotel 1 or 2 nights, but you're certainly not going to live in a hotel. Well, most of us anyway. So that's the problem that the legislator that requested this was concerned about, is that this was a situation where, in a lot of cases, those that can sometimes easily be preyed upon can get themselves into trouble.
And in fact, we did find that there are people who, in effect, take a cab drive all the way across the country.
Absolutely. We'll show you a little later in the report how we have people, we found people that were in payday loans well over half of the year. So this slide shows what we already covered a little bit, that in Utah, there are some consumer protections in place. This is what existed before the audit. Jim talked about the 70-day limit. At that time, the lender cannot charge interest anymore and needs to give the borrower an opportunity to enter into an extended payment plan to try to pay it off. This all hinges upon the other part of the consumer protection, which is our regulator. In Utah, the Department of Financial Institutions is the entity that regulates the industry. They have statutory authority to audit the payday lenders and to fine them. The trouble that we found right off the bat when we started dealing with our regulator is they want to do all this under this notion of voluntary compliance. Didn't want to really be the bad guy. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we keep going. So this led to our audit scope and objectives, much of which we've alluded to already, but the requester and our audit subcommittee, through authorizing this audit, wanted us to know if the state limits on the duration of payday loans are effective at preventing borrowers from overuse, and how effective are our regulations in general and our regulators. And does the department, or DFI, gather information needed from lenders to obtain an accurate view of the industry? So this is what we focused on. So in our reports, Chapter 2 usually contains the largest finding after an introduction chapter of 1. And we did, in fact, learn in our audit that the state limits on payday loans may not be preventing overuse, and that's maybe even a conservative way to put it. Before we get into some of the findings, I wanted to just talk a little bit about what we were up against. And this was important because it kind of factored into some of the criteria that was needed in the methodology review. Our legislature was being given two conflicting point of views, as is often the situation in some of these situations. The industry was claiming that the state 70-day limit on the duration of payday loans was making sure everything was okay, that borrowers could pay it off and there would be minimal impact. But critics were quick to point out that what we've already demonstrated, these borrowers could become overextended. So our research objective was to determine if the 70-day limit was adequate protection. So here's what we were up against. We would need to get complete loan histories in order to do this. But as we talked about, we didn't have access, technically didn't have access to this data. These are private providers, 63 different companies in Utah.
And not only that, Darren, can I add that we needed to get the loan history from multiple lenders, because if a borrower could go to 2 or 3 different places in their community, get loans, then just going to one lender would not give us the data we needed.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things Jim and the rest of the team discovered as they went out and did their undercover work. Essentially, Jim just walked into some payday lenders and just inquired about getting a loan, and he was able to get the individuals in there to talk about that and learn that that's a lot what happened is loans would be taken out in multiple places.
Another thing we did was we found some contact information of actual borrowers in the files at the department, whether they might have issued a complaint or something and we saw contact information there, or for other reasons. There were a few lists of actual clients, and we took the liberty of calling, or at least trying to call some of those folks, and we found it was in very difficult to actually get enough people with the contact information that we had available. We were surprised that, well, we shouldn't have been maybe, but this is can be a fairly transitory population that's moving around a bit, and they're hard to find. And so actually going out and surveying the population of users would have been very difficult. And so we turned to the lenders themselves for the data set that we needed to get. So some of the methodologies we considered but rejected because of some of what we're alluding to is that we couldn't do a statewide survey. In fact, until some of the work that Jim did in the introduction of our audit, we didn't even have an estimate of what the total population was. We did some of that work on our own, but so we weren't going to be able to do a customer or statewide survey. We also weren't going to be able to survey customers as they entered and left the store. They're just reluctant to share, and that shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody. And lenders really didn't necessarily want us there. We had numerous conversations on the phone with lenders. Some of them would talk with us openly and express their displeasure. We eventually, of course, had to use our regulator to get the data, which is what we were eventually able to do. But attorney calls, a lot of roadblocks put up. The other one would be to just, hey, why don't we just go in or have the department get us some records? The problem with this is without a full knowledge of everywhere that an individual went to get payday loans, we wouldn't know if we had a full study of their payday lending habits, payday borrowing habits. So this is what we came up with as a team. I'm going to let Jim describe some of this. So we knew we had to survey a population, and we identified 5 communities, mostly rural communities in Utah, with populations no more than 100,000 maybe. And what we did was we said, okay, we're going to identify all of the payday lenders in those isolated communities, and we're going to ask them for a list of all of their customers for a full year, and just get a list. And we took that list, we got those lists, and we did a random sample. We believed we had the total population of customers in the community, and we're able to isolate the lenders that they would most likely, all the lenders that they most likely would have used. And then we asked each lender to provide us with the complete loan history for those clients that we sampled.
One of the things that we were encouraged to point out in our application for the Methodology Award by, actually I'll give a shout out to Wayne Kidd, who's on our NCSL Executive Committee. He's from our office. He said, what he believed was innovative is that we said, look, we have these natural geographic areas in the state that would keep a borrower from going too far to get other loans other than just the surrounding area. So we were pretty confident that we would get their full history by doing that. So with our contained design, we created the study of 3,000 customers from 14 different lenders in these 5 communities. From this, we were confident that we could get loan histories from a statistically represented sample of 303 individuals. Now, we were confident because we had been working with DFI, with the regulators, and had a pretty good sense that if we were using them to get the data, that this wasn't going to be a burdensome number of individuals. and then we could infer to the communities. So we alluded to some of the steps, but let's make sure that we've covered them all. To first create a study population of payday loan customers. This is where we involved our regulators, and what I talked about at the top of the hour, that we would need to use them. We couldn't show up at the payday lender and say, give me loan histories. We actually had the director of the payday loan division there send out emails with what we had requested with the random sample, and had the lenders send them into DFI. They were welcome to look at the records, but they actually just forwarded them directly onto us. We were impressed with how they just did that and said, look, this is your study. In fact, one interesting side note that I just remembered is at the end, when we shared the results with them, we wanted to get their feedback. And Jim, do you remember what they told us?
I can't remember.
They just said, well, this is your study, so whatever you want to conclude.
Yeah.
So we thought that was a little amusing, that they literally just wanted to be the pass-through entity. One of the things we found right off the top with these 3,000 is this is where we could tell with some of the confidence of the geographic boundaries to these different areas, is that right off the top, 14% we could tell we're getting loans from multiple lenders, which was part of what we thought was happening. So we got these loan histories for the 303, and this is where we feel like we really pulled the finding together. And I give Jim all the credit for classifying. We had long discussions about how to classify this, because it wasn't based on any existing criteria anywhere else. It was just, we conducted some academic research and got some ideas about maybe language of different kind of users, but we took this and classified it into 4 different kinds of users. This is the first time any of this kind of information had been gathered for our legislature in any kind of way, whether from the industry, whether they were trying to lobby, in any way, or by our regulators. And it came down to this chart. Those of you that might have downloaded the audit, it's page 8. And I'm going to let Jim kind of describe this chart to you.
Okay, if you remember at the beginning of the audit, we had 2 assertions. One was people are paying off their loans and it's all good. The other assertion was we got these people are being trapped by these loans. And so our question was, well, which is it? And as you can see from this chart, it's a mix of both. We have some low-risk users who are paying off their loans very quickly. These are people that had their loans out for no more than 60 days, and then they pay them off. They never default, and they basically use the product the way it should be used. There was another 37% who we were also not too concerned about them. They paid off their loans between 60 days and 180 days, or 6 months. And no, they might have missed a payment or two, but we didn't consider them as people that were getting exposed to a huge deal of risk. Now, the other 2 populations, they're the ones we had concerns about. 32% of the customers, or about 1 out of 3, were deep into some obligations. They were in them. They had loans outstanding for more than 6 months during the year of our study, and they usually were paying interest that was at least 2.5 times what they borrowed. So these are folks that are really, really being stressed by this product. And then we have this other population that we really hadn't anticipated, but they're what we call the defaulters. And these are people who just go in, get the loan, and you never hear from them again. The industry likes to use the term shoplifter to describe this population. So our overall conclusion is about half the people are using this product without exposing themselves to a lot of risk or harm, while a third are using it and they're really getting hurt by it. And then we got this 14% that are just ripping off the lender.
We got a little pushback when we presented this, especially with this category that we call chronic users. The industry didn't like that, but we didn't know what else to use, because if you're having a payday loan more than half the year, we think that's chronic use, especially when you add up the interest and that you're going to spend the rest of the year just trying to pay that off.
Another interesting thing that we thought was really quite fascinating is, I'll let you guess where all the income comes to the lender. Where are they making their money? Do you think they're making their money off of the low-risk users or the moderate-risk users? No. They are making, by and large, all of their income off of this chronic user population.
And the reason that we really wanted to strongly communicate this to our legislature, all the while making sure that we were being an independent voice, was because we found that. Because we had an industry that was telling the legislature and in their written material that this product is designed for those that just have a short-term need, and in fact they claim they advise them to make sure they pay it off and move along, but that's not what we found was happening in almost half the cases. Before we move off this slide, I just wanted to mention a couple of things that in terms of our application for the methodology award, there were two questions that were asked, about efficiency and effectiveness of the methodology. The reason that we felt it was efficient is that even though it took us a while to come up to speed, which is the case in every audit, we all know that, every audit or every research project, we were able to settle on this methodology where we did this sampling, especially in an era when we're able to take full sets of data. We were able to still use sampling to get the results quickly and then effective, because what we had talked about before is that this had not been communicated to our legislature before, these borrowing habits. And so we felt confident in presenting that. So we're going to break right here for a second. We have a question coming in from our moderator. Were legislators and interest groups interested in the methods used in the report, and did the strength of the methods enter into the public debate and improve the credibility of the report, particularly in the eyes of people who are inclined to support the payday lending industry? I'll give some of my take, and then Jim can as well. This was a very, very interesting release, to say the least. In Utah, as is probably the case in most states that have an audit committee, they're the gatekeeper. They hear the audit first. It becomes public the moment that we begin the presentation to them. We had a great discussion with our audit subcommittee. They asked a lot of questions. They were very engaged. Our audit subcommittee then, by legislative rule, assigns each audit to a topic-specific legislative committee. So this went to Business and Labor Interim, an interim joint committee of the House and the Senate. We were not put on that agenda. There were some behind the scenes discussions, and just as your question alludes to, Ed, about the industry, they were able to talk with one of the co-chairs and said, we're going to propose some fixes. We don't need to hear the report. And so, yeah, it was an interesting public release. And we'll get in a minute to some of the changes that, there were some changes made, but there were some that we felt we wanted to see made through our recommendations that we were not able to have. Jim, did you want to add anything to that?
I think my impression was that our audit committee was very receptive. They loved the depth of analysis. They loved that we came with 3,000 actual loan histories to support our findings. I was thinking somebody might question that we only used more rural, no urban locations in our sample, but nobody questioned that. And frankly, I'm not sure it made a difference. But I thought the results were really, really well received. It's just a very, very hard area for legislators to do anything with, because the payday loan industry, frankly, has got a lot of influence in well, not just in Utah, but everywhere.
But hold that thought. We'll get to the rest of that answer that question when we talk about what was put into place. We did have a question on whether we use Social Security numbers to match borrowers across the different lenders. We did not get socials. We did get the name, full name, their address, and phone number. And from that information, we were pretty well able to make sure we identified that there was no mismatching in the names. We did not need to get the socials, because once we got the full sample for that area, once we had the loan histories, you could tell that it was the same person.
Yeah.
So hopefully that answered your question. That came from Eric. So let's move on to, there was a couple other questions about the methodology. I think we've really discussed this, that we believed our conclusions were clearly described for the reader, largely based on the figures in the report. We mentioned the audit subcommittee giving us good, receiving this well, and led to useful recommendations. And this is part two of that question. The legislature did respond despite some initial pushback from the industry. We did pass House Bill 40 in the 2017 general session that enacted one additional restriction that we recommended, that made it, just to make it more difficult to roll old loans into new ones and use the new loans to pay it off. So they set some restrictions on that. We have a request in, even as we speak, from the original audit requester, Representative Brad Daw, to go in sometime probably later this year and do a follow-up to see, pull another sample to see if that legislation is helping. The legislation also directed our Department of Financial Institutions to strengthen its review. A couple things that we specifically recommended are in place now. First, they actually need to use their finding authority. They would sometimes go 3 years with a payday lender that showed problems and not find them, because they were just seeking this voluntary compliance and will keep giving you a chance. The other one, which is probably even better in our eyes, is they, rather than just going to every single storefront, payday loan storefront in the state, of which there were over 100, to do their audit, to do their, well, they call it an evaluation, we suggested that they do some risk analysis and target. If there's some companies that don't appear to be behaving as well as others, to go there. And so they've now changed their evaluation methodology to
or they don't need to go to every store. If a lender has 15 outlets, they can do 2 or 3 and pretty well decide if that outlet, if that lender is following the rules. Before they were trying to get to every single outlet for every single lender, and we just didn't think that made a lot of sense.
So we have a couple of charts next that help us get a little bit more into the weeds about these borrower habits and what we found in our sample. I'm going to have Jim walk you through an example. This is one of somebody that just kept using new loans to pay off old.
Yeah, this is a chart we use to describe for legislators and the public exactly what we were seeing with that chronic population, that 1/3 of the users that were, of the borrowers that were just getting caught up in this. As you can see, it's all the same lender, lender A. We didn't want to identify the name of the lender, but the lender A gave 7 loans to this individual, $500 loans each. And as you can see on the right-hand side, the columns there, that the initiation date and the close date kind of run consecutively down the list. And it is apparent that the one loan would be replaced by another loan, which is actually not supposed to happen. The industry says it never happens. Well, you can see here it does. And even when you see that one loan is closed and then another loan is open the next day, we were pretty suspicious that that was a carryover, because some of the lending staff, the staff of the lending agency said, well, they could post date or put the date down for the new loan as the next day if they wanted to. And so we were pretty well convinced that what we were seeing here was a loan for $500 that was actually for, let's see, it says 370 days. So this person had a loan for $500 for 370 days, and the total interest paid was $2,452. And by the way, we don't know exactly who this was, but these are people who are usually making between $20,000 and $30,000, maybe $35,000 a year. So that $2,400 is a pretty significant amount of money for that household.
So this next example is what we thought was happening at the beginning of the audit too. Was an individual was going to multiple lenders using the same check collateral to get multiple loans. So I'll have Jim run you through this example as well.
So what we did was to help, again, the legislature understand the dynamics at play. We've got the lenders listed along the left-hand column, and we've given each lender a different color so you can see how the borrower is going from one lender to another, picking up loans. And in the red boxes represent loans that were outstanding from multiple lenders at the same time. And the problem with that, it should be pretty obvious, is that if I have a paycheck for $500 and I'm taking out a loan against that, you would like to think that nobody else is taking out a loan, is giving a loan against that same $500. Well, that's not the case. They're going and they're obtaining a loan from multiple people, multiple lenders at the same time against the same paychecks. The industry again said it never happens, and of course this data shows it does.
So we're a few minutes away from a Q&A, but let me see if we can just mention to you real quickly the recommendations that we gave to the legislature. We talked about the bill that passed already, but I mentioned earlier that there was something that we recommended that we thought could be even more helpful in our recommendations that did not get implemented. That was to create a database to monitor the loans. And this is, of the 35 states that allow payday loans, 15 use this type of a database tool. In fact, I'm going to...
Let's just go to the next slide.
Go to this slide to show you.
So those with in the blue column, second from the left. If that's your state, your state has probably got the best mechanism for controlling payday lending. You have this database. The state requires the lender to submit the loan application to the database, and it validates that the borrower does not have another loan outstanding at somebody with some other lender, or there's other restrictions that you can put on the loan. Some states will say, well, we want to have restrictions on the number of loans that you can have out in a certain in the same year, and so that database will allow you to apply that kind of regulation. That we thought was the best approach to regulating this. Of course, on the far left column, these are states that they just either flat out say we're not going to have payday loans, or we have some that effectively prohibited payday loans by requiring that the interest rates be so low that it effectively makes it so undesirable to be in the business that nobody does it. Of course, as you can see on the very far right-hand columns, the states that have just a number of restrictions, and we show Utah there with South Dakota as having the fewest regulations in the country.
So just to go back, our other recommendations were to take a stronger approach to regulation, which we believe to some extent was enacted in that bill, where the department was encouraged to be a little bit more proactive, and they have been doing that. And then the additional statutory limits, that was the one we talked about, where to prohibit the new loans paying off old loans. So we'll see how that.
Well, there's one other restriction on there we ought to mention. Utah requires that lenders offer a 60-day extended payment plan. Now, a lot of borrowers don't mention that to a lot of lenders don't mention that to their borrowers. And so Representative Daw thought that, well, let's make sure that each borrower knows that they have this option. So he passed a law that required lenders that before they went to file a lawsuit against a client for not paying on a loan, that they had to send them a written notice saying, you have an extended payment plan available to you for 60 days, during which you can pay this off, and before which we will file suit against you.
We did recommend a couple different areas that were not adopted. There are 7 key payday loan regulations used in other states. You saw the other states chart that we had up. We can go back to that in a minute, but Utah only uses 2 of these, number 2 and number 7, the loan duration that we talked about, the 70 days, and the EPP. So we tried to do some things to strengthen that, but we also recommended, and it was not yet considered, but this representative thinks that when we do the follow-up sample, he believes there may still be some problems, and may want to consider number 1, number 4, number 5, or any of the other 7. So
I think the strategy that Daw agreed to, working with other legislators, is that they would take an incremental approach to tightening up the regulations on this. And so he's applied a couple of additional restrictions to payday lending in Utah, anticipating that we will do another audit to see if that has the desired effect, and then reassess after we do our follow-up audit.
So we're at our time limit, but we just really have one more quick area. We just wanted to also, as part of this recommendation package, say that the DFI can regulate better if they would ask for additional data. So this isn't something the legislature needs to do, but we just found it curious right off the bat when we started getting into the data. and we realized they didn't ask for the total number of loans or total dollar amounts or number of individuals or defaults on loans. And we just said, you could do so much with this data to target where you need to go and to look for trends. And so we thought that that would be helpful. And the DFI is considering asking for more of that data. So Ed, can we throw this back to you for a minute, and maybe we can respond to some questions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Darren and James, for the excellent presentation. We are now moving into the question and answer period. And I wanted to thank you for answering my question earlier. Some people have already started typing questions in the chat box, and we have one from Jason, and it's, was anyone referred for criminal prosecution as a result of your study?
No, there wasn't any grounds, we believe, to prosecute them.
It's a great question, but yeah, they would have to have actually been breaking the law rather than just being what some consider to be predatory. So,
just to speak to that a little bit, our legislature, and I imagine most legislatures, really grapple with the problem of how much do we get into preventing people from doing dumb things, like taking out a payday loan. And while we recognize that people have to exercise their own discretion in how they manage their finances, we need to balance that idea with the need to prevent from the lenders to take advantage of unsuspecting people. And so that really is a challenge, but there is no law that prevents people from taking out many multiple loans at a time, or one after another. Another question, Ed?
Absolutely. Yeah. We have one. I'll actually skip mine. Mine's kind of lengthy. We have one from Melinda Hamilton, who asks, when do you plan to conduct a follow-up audit?
Well, hi, Melinda. Hope things are good in Michigan. So, like I said, we have that follow-up request on the books. I actually had a discussion, Jim and I had a discussion with Representative about this, and we convinced him that it would be good to give the department some time to implement not only the House bill that passed last year. Even though it passed during session, it didn't go into effect until May of last year. We thought, you ought to give that a good year at least before we do anything, and then give the department some time to get out to some targeted storefronts and do some other things that they had in mind before we do any follow-up. So we think that maybe that would get prioritized later in the year to maybe start some work in the fall.
Excellent. We have another question from. Did you have anything else you wanted to say on that point?
Hopefully that answered it from Linda.
Excellent. So we have another one. I just didn't mean to cut you off. We have another one from Scott Swaggerty, who asks, did you have any concerns with the quality of data or do any validation work to ensure it was complete and reliable?
We did. We went out. We were not just taking that data for granted. We actually went out and took a sample of that data and visited the lenders and pulled their records to make sure that what we were seeing was actually in their records.
And what was interesting about that, Scott, is when we talked about the challenges we had getting the data and getting to the storefronts, and particularly a couple of companies that even retained some legal counsel. The interesting thing is once the department asked for the data and made the request and they sent it to us, they didn't seem to mind so much once we went back to them and sat down with them with the data. So that was just an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, they were not that resistant to us coming and validating the data.
They were pretty cooperative once we got there. So, next question, Ed.
Yeah, the next question we have is from Jason again. He asks, did you make the table of state laws and restrictions all on your own?
The answer is yes. We have a great staff member, Michael. I think you're listening in. Michael Allred, who was a team member that did the research on this, put it together, and so kudos to him. We really appreciated this, and we thought this was one of the, again, when Wayne approached us and suggested we apply, he said, you know, this other states table is good information. So
there are sources out there, and you can find them on the web, that shows every state's laws, but to summarize them in a way that is easily digested is hard, and that's really what Michael was able to do. We had to settle on, you know, how many groups to create, and those that effectively prohibit payday loans. That was a bit tough to discern, but as we looked at it, we said, well, they don't have any payday lenders, but they don't outlaw it, so we created that category.
So since we're on the topic of team members, I see, Ed, if you don't mind me just jumping in, Lucas is asking how many team members. There was myself and Jim and Michael, as I mentioned, and then one other team member, Catherine Stanfill. Unfortunately, she had other plans, and wasn't able to be with us for the whole audit. We could have used a bigger team, to be honest, but you know, you do what you can do with your limited resources.
And we have another question from Katrin Osterhaus, who asks, what challenges did you have in preparing and storing the data?
Hi, Katrin. That's always a challenge, making sure that you keep the data secure. In fact, early on, when we were working with the legal counsel to the lenders, and they were sending concerns through the Department of Financial Institutions attorney, which got a little complicated, and then we, using our own attorney, we had this lovely merry-go-round of 3 different levels of attorneys. They wanted some kind of assurance from us that we would keep the data safe. And so, of course, we sent them our data security policies and talked about, you know, how we have encrypted laptops and everything would stay on a server, and that we would take some of the PPI or PII, personally identifying information, out. But yeah, it was definitely a challenge there, and that's why we were glad that in the end at least we only had this sample, and we didn't have to have, you know, this whole large database. So I'm not sure, Katrin, if that's getting to the heart of your question. Maybe Jim has some more to add.
There was a lot of data, and we did. If you're interested, we can go into a little bit of how we did it. We used Excel, and mostly Excel to manage this. Catherine was a whiz at putting together formulas and was able to organize the data, and we were able to pull down different sectors of the population, and pretty much did it all through Access. It was a bit of a challenge receiving information from 14 different lenders, often in different formats.
Yeah, if I remember right, Jim, some of it just came PDF. So, you know, we couldn't get in to some of the loan history, so we ended up going back and asking them if they'd actually put it in more electronic. And of course, there's software out there that will read a PDF and you know, put it into readable form, but that takes time as well.
And we might as well mention that there was one lender who said, no, we will not send you the data, but you can come to our office and look at it. And so we went and spent a day at their office and inputted the data by hand. We knew our sample. It was probably some 60 60 clients that we went in and we had to type in their loan history just because, I don't know, they just wanted to be ornery, I guess.
But we got it.
We got it, yeah.
Well, that's, if I can ask a follow-up to that, I mean, sometimes I know when we're getting data from different organizations, in some cases we have a relationship with them where we can just extract their whole database and all the raw tables. And in other cases, in fact, we even requested some data from Payday lenders about 4 or 5 years ago, and in that case, we received it, and it was already, all the queries had been done, so we didn't have to get into their system. And for any of the lenders, did you have to learn how their system was set up and really interface with their IT people, or was it mostly in queries? Certainly, if it's a PDF, it sounds like it's just already a query that's been run.
Yeah, they would run some of their own reports. Some of them with more advanced systems were able to download it and just give it to us as a text file or as an Excel file. There's a handful of these entities that were really, really kind of like a mom and pop operation without a lot of sophistication, and we just took what we could. Usually, fortunately, our sample didn't pull too many of their clients when they were that small. But virtually everybody had some kind of a computer system that they used to enter in their clients and follow the loans. But some of them were not very sophisticated systems.
Well, Ed, looks like we're maybe up against a time crunch, so we'll turn it back to you.
Absolutely. Well, again, thanks to all of our speakers, Darren and James, and all of you who joined us today. This webinar has been recorded and will be made available on the NCSL website in the next week or so. This webinar is now concluded.
Thanks, Ed.
Thank you.
Thanks.